The Lost Camper. I shouldn't be alive to tell this story. That's not melodrama or exaggeration. It's a cold, clinical fact that I've come to accept. According to the laws of nature and probability, my body should be decomposing somewhere in the northern wilderness of the Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest. My disappearance, nothing more than a statistic. My name, another faded missing persons flyer tacked to a ranger station bulletin board. But here I am, breathing, writing, and constantly looking over my shoulder. Before I share what happened, I need you to understand something. I'm not crazy. I'm not on drugs. I'm not seeking attention. In fact, I debated for months whether to share this at all. But the symbols I found scratched into my car last week convinced me that silence won't protect me anymore. If anything happens to me after posting this, at least there will be a record. Maybe it will save someone else. I used to love solitude. 5 weeks ago, I was the guy who would roll his eyes when friends canceled camping trips, then happily go anyway, alone. The guy with the meticulously organized gear, who could tell you the weight of his pack down to the ounce. The guy who felt more at home under pine trees than under a roof. Now I sleep with the lights on. Now I've installed 6 new locks on my apartment door. Now I flinch at the sound of branches against my window. It started as a simple 5-day solo trip, a chance to clear my head after a brutal work project and an equally brutal breakup. I'd planned this route through the most remote section of the forest for months. 16 miles in, loop around Alpine Lake, 16 miles back. No cell service, no people, no problems. Just me, the wilderness, and enough physical exertion to exhaust any lingering anxiety. I remember checking the weather forecast obsessively the week before. Clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect September camping conditions. I remember stopping for coffee at the last small-town diner before the forest entrance, making small talk with the waitress, feeling that familiar excitement build as civilization fell away in my rearview mirror. I even remember thinking, as I pulled into the deserted trailhead parking lot around noon, how lucky I was to have the place to myself. The only other sign of humanity was a dusty blue Subaru with Wisconsin plates parked in the far corner. I noted it automatically, an old habit from years of backcountry travel. Always know who else is out there. If I had known then what that car meant, I would have turned around. I would have driven straight home, packed my things, and moved to another state, another country. But I didn't know, so I shouldered my pack, double-checked my map, and headed into the trees, breathing deeply of pine-scented air as the sounds of the road disappeared behind me. The first day was perfect. That's the cruel part. How normal, how peaceful it all began. The trail was challenging enough to be interesting, but not grueling. Fall colors were just beginning to emerge, splashes of gold and crimson among the green. I spotted deer tracks, a fox, countless birds. I covered about 7 miles before finding an ideal campsite near a small stream around 5 p.m. Setup was automatic after years of practice. Tent positioned for drainage, sleeping system arranged, cook area established downwind. I fished for an hour without luck, then boiled water for the freeze-dried beef stroganoff I'd brought along. As darkness fell, I built a small fire and sat watching the flames, feeling the day's tension melt from my shoulders. That's when I first noticed the silence. If you've spent time in forests, you know they're never truly quiet. There's a constant symphony, wind in leaves, insects chirping, small animals rustling, distant bird calls. But as the fire burned down to embers, I realized I couldn't hear any of that. Just the occasional crack of the fire and my own breathing. The silence felt physical, like pressure against my eardrums. I told myself it was just an atmospheric condition. Temperature inversion, maybe. Or perhaps a predator was passing nearby, causing the forest creatures to hide. I even stuck a finger in each ear to check for blockage. "Hello?" I called out experimentally, my voice sounding flat and muffled. No echo. The sound seemed to travel a few feet and then die, absorbed by the unnatural stillness. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. I added more wood to the fire, trying to rationalize the creeping unease. I was tired. It was getting cold. Forests do strange things with acoustics sometimes, but deep down, some ancient part of my brain was screaming that something was wrong. I should have left then, packed up in the dark and hiked back to my car, navigating by headlamp. People do dumber things when spooked in the wilderness, but I've always prided myself on being rational, on not giving in to imagined threats. So I crawled into my tent instead, zipping the sleeping bag up to my chin, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I even managed to fall asleep eventually, the exhaustion of the day's hike overcoming my unease. I dreamed of standing stones and whispers just beyond hearing. Morning brought normality with it. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, the stream burbled pleasantly. I felt embarrassed about my nocturnal anxiety as I boiled water for coffee and oatmeal. The forest was beautiful in the slanting morning light, dew sparkling on spider webs strung between branches. But as I packed up camp, I noticed something odd. My camping mug wasn't where I'd left it by the fire pit. It was sitting neatly on top of my pack, which I was certain I'd fully closed before going to sleep. I stood there, freeze-dried meal packet in hand, staring at the mug. Had I moved it last night before bed and forgotten? Possibly. Sleep deprivation can do strange things to memory, but I didn't think so. I'm methodical about camp setup and tear down, have been since Boy Scouts. The mug should have been with my cook set. I looked around the campsite carefully, scanning the ground for tracks. The earth was relatively hard here, not showing footprints easily, but I did notice a few broken twigs and compressed leaves leading from the edge of camp to where my pack had been. "Hello?" I called out. "Someone there?" Nothing but normal forest sounds answered me. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or fox investigating my camp after I'd gone to sleep. That made more sense than a person sneaking into, move my mug? It was absurd to think someone would do that. Still, I found myself packing up more quickly than usual, checking repeatedly over my shoulder as I worked. By 8:30 a.m., I was back on the trail, pushing deeper into the forest, trying to shake the lingering unease. The hiking helped. Physical exertion has always cleared my head, and the trail grew more challenging as it wound upward, requiring my full attention in places. By midday, I was feeling more like myself, stopping to photograph interesting fungi and a pair of hawks circling overhead. The second night's campsite was near a small, unnamed lake, really more of a large pond, about 8 miles from my starting point. I set up camp on a rise with a good view of the water, built a small fire ring, and spent the afternoon exploring the shoreline. No other hikers, no signs of human presence at all, just pristine wilderness. As the sun began to set, I returned to camp and got a fire going. The flames reflected off the still water of the lake, creating a mirror image of dancing light. It was postcard perfect, exactly the kind of moment I'd come out here for. That's when I saw the first light. It was just a momentary flash among the trees on the far shore, so brief I might have imagined it, like someone striking a match or switching on a flashlight for just a second. Then darkness again. I stood up, straining to see across the water in the fading light. "Hey!" I called out, my voice carrying across the lake. "Hello there." No response, no further lights, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the crackling of my fire. I sat back down, considering the possibilities. Another camper maybe, though I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. A hunter, though hunting season hadn't started yet. Perhaps a forest ranger checking the area. 10 minutes later, I saw it again. Same spot. This time, the light hung in the darkness for nearly 5 seconds, long enough to confirm I wasn't imagining things. It was definitely artificial, a yellowish-white beam that didn't move like a flashlight would, but remained stationary among the trees. I considered hiking around the lake to investigate, but quickly dismissed the idea. Navigating unfamiliar forest in darkness is dangerous even for experienced hikers. Besides, the lake was larger than it looked. It would take at least an hour to reach that spot on the far shore. So I did what seemed reasonable. I took out my emergency whistle and gave 3 sharp blasts, the universal wilderness signal for help or come to me. The sound pierced the evening air, echoing slightly across the water. The light winked out immediately. I waited, watching the far shore. Minutes passed. The fire popped and hissed beside me. Nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to turn away, lights appeared again. Not one this time, but 3, spaced evenly apart, steady, unwavering, and they seemed to be higher up, as if they had moved up into the trees. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the chilly evening air. Those weren't flashlights or lanterns. They didn't move like lights held by people. They just hovered, watching. I stood frozen, my whistle still clutched in my hand, as the three lights remained fixed on me from across the dark water. 1 minute, 2. I didn't move. They didn't move. Then, as if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive, all three lights blinked out simultaneously. I waited for them to reappear, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing happened. After 15 minutes of staring into the darkness, I finally forced myself to sit back down by the fire, though I positioned myself so I could keep watching the far shore. The lights didn't return that night, but neither did sleep come easily. I kept the fire burning higher than I normally would, feeding it precious firewood whenever it started to die down. The dancing flames provided both light and comfort, though they also ruined my night vision and cast moving shadows that made me jump more than once. Around 3 a.m., I dozed off despite my best efforts to stay alert. When I jerked awake sometime later, the fire had burned down to embers, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. Instinctively, I looked toward the far shore. No lights, but something else caused my breath to catch in my throat. A dense, unnatural fog had formed over the lake. Not the wispy morning mist that's common over water, but a thick, opaque bank that hovered about 2 feet above the surface. Despite the lack of wind, the fog was moving, rotating slowly counterclockwise like water circling a drain, and it was coming closer to my shore. As I watched, the leading edge of it reached the shoreline and began to creep up the slight incline toward my campsite. I scrambled to throw more wood on the fire, hands shaking as I worked to bring the flames back to life. The fog continued its steady advance, seeming to thicken as it moved onto land. Within minutes, it had reached the outer edges of my campsite. The fire blazed higher now, and the advancing fog seemed to hesitate at the circle of light it cast. That's when I heard it, a sound from within the fog. Not splashing, not footsteps, a soft, continuous sound like cloth being torn very slowly, or dry leaves being crumbled in a gentle fist. It moved in short bursts, stop, start, circling my campsite just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my hiking poles, the closest things I had to weapons, and stood with my back to the fire, turning in slow circles as the sound moved around me. The fog had completely encircled my camp now, a wall of white that blocked any view of what lay beyond. And still, that tearing, rustling sound continued its circuit. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "This isn't funny!" The sound stopped immediately. Complete silence fell, more absolute than seemed possible in a forest. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted. Then came the whisper. "Thomas." My name. My actual name. Not spoken loudly, but clearly audible, as if someone had whispered it directly into my ear. I spun around, poles raised defensively, but there was no one there. Just fire, fog, and darkness. "Who are you?" I demanded, hearing the edge of panic in my voice. "What do you want?" No answer came. Just that unnatural silence, stretching on, broken only by my own ragged breathing and pounding heart. I'm not sure how long I stood there, poised for an attack that never came. Eventually, I became aware that the eastern sky was lightening almost imperceptibly, dawn approaching. As if responding to this change, the fog began to thin and recede, pulling back from my campsite and dissolving as the sky grew brighter. By the time the sun crested the trees, the fog was gone completely. The lake's surface was peaceful, reflecting the morning sky. Birds began to sing. The forest returned to life as if nothing had happened. But something had changed inside me. The wilderness that had always been my sanctuary now felt threatening, alien. As I made breakfast with trembling hands, I decided to cut my trip short. I'd hike back to the trailhead today instead of continuing deeper into the forest as planned. I broke camp quickly, leaving nothing behind but a scuffed patch of earth and the stone ring of my fire pit. As I shouldered my pack and took one last look at the lake, something caught my eye on the ground near where I'd slept. A small stone about the size of a silver dollar had been placed on the exact spot where my head had rested. It hadn't been there when I'd packed up my sleeping pad. I would have noticed it. The stone was unusual, perfectly circular, as if machine-cut, with a symbol etched into its surface. A crude stick figure with elongated limbs and no visible head, surrounded by what looked like 3 small circles. I should have left it there, should have walked away without touching it. But curiosity overcame caution, and I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. The underside was blank, the stone cool despite the morning sun. Almost without thinking, I slipped it into my pocket. That simple action, that moment of curiosity over caution, may have sealed my fate. As I turned to leave, I glanced once more across the lake to the spot where I'd seen the lights. In the daylight, I could make out a small clearing among the trees, and there, barely visible at this distance, was what appeared to be a structure of some kind, a building where no building should be. I hesitated, torn between fear and the need to understand what had happened during the night. In the end, curiosity won again. I decided to circle the lake and investigate before heading back to the trailhead. After all, it was daylight now. Whatever had been out there in the darkness would surely be less threatening in the light of day. I couldn't have been more wrong. As I made my way around the lakeshore, the forest grew denser, the undergrowth more tangled. The trail disappeared entirely on this side of the lake, forcing me to push through thick brush, guided only by occasional glimpses of the water to my right. The journey took longer than expected. What had seemed like a relatively small lake from my campsite proved deceptively large when traveling on foot through difficult terrain. By the time I neared the far shore, nearly 2 hours had passed, and sweat soaked my shirt despite the cool morning air. The structure I'd spotted from across the lake gradually took form through the trees. A small cabin, weathered gray with age, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. It sat in a small clearing about 50 yards back from the shoreline, looking as if it had grown from the forest floor rather than being built there. No smoke rose from its stone chimney. No signs of recent habitation were visible. I approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding forest for movement. The silence that had unnerved me the previous night returned as I neared the cabin, a bubble of unnatural quiet surrounding the structure. No birds called, no insects buzzed, even the sound of my footsteps seemed muffled, as if I were walking on carpet instead of forest debris. The cabin itself was smaller than it had first appeared, maybe 12 by 15 feet, constructed of rough-hewn logs, chinked with what looked like clay and moss. A single window faced the lake, its glass long gone, the opening covered with weathered boards nailed haphazardly across it. The door, a solid piece of timber that had warped with age, stood slightly ajar, as if inviting entry. But it was what surrounded the door that made me stop in my tracks. Symbols. Dozens of them, carved deeply into the wood of the doorframe and the logs on either side. Some I recognized from anthropology classes, protection sigils from various cultures, wards against evil. Others were completely foreign to me, complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. And there, at eye level on the door itself, was the same symbol from the stone in my pocket, the headless figure surrounded by 3 circles. I reached into my pocket, fingers closing around the stone as a chill ran through me, despite the strengthening sun. This couldn't be coincidence. Someone had been in my camp last night, had placed this stone deliberately, had whispered my name. Common sense screamed at me to turn around, to get back to the trail, to civilization, but another deeper part of me needed answers. How did they know my name? What did they want? What was this place? Adjusting my pack straps, I stepped closer to the cabin. The partially open door revealed only darkness beyond. No sounds came from within. I stood to the side of the doorway, not directly in front, and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice fell flat in the unnatural silence. No response came from the cabin. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open wider with the tip of my hiking pole. It swung inward with a low creak, revealing a single-room interior dimly lit by what sunlight could penetrate the boarded window and open door. The cabin appeared long abandoned. A layer of dust covered every surface. A rough wooden table stood in the center, accompanied by a single chair. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes in its hearth. A narrow cot with a rotted mattress occupied the corner farthest from the door. Shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of canned goods with faded labels, glass jars containing unidentifiable substances, and various tools. But it was the wall above the cot that drew my attention immediately. Unlike the other walls of bare logs, this one was covered with papers, newspaper clippings, maps, and handwritten notes, all connected by lengths of red string thumbtacked in complex patterns between them. I stepped inside cautiously, floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The air inside was stale and carried a faint metallic odor I couldn't identify. I moved toward the papered wall, drawn by what appeared to be a map at its center, a detailed rendering of the forest I was currently in, with various locations marked in red. As I got closer, I realized that the newspaper clippings were all missing persons reports. Dozens of them, spanning what looked like decades based on the yellowing of the older papers. Each featured a photograph and brief description of someone who had disappeared in these woods. And on each photograph, someone had drawn the same symbol that was on my stone and the cabin door. My heart began to race as I scanned the faces. Most were unfamiliar, but one near the bottom caught my eye, a recent article, the paper still white and crisp. The headline read, "Search continues for missing hiker," above a photo of a smiling young woman with a backpack. I recognized her immediately as Emma Larson's, whose disappearance had been in the local news shortly before my trip. She had last been seen starting a solo hike in this very forest. Her blue Subaru found abandoned at a trailhead. The blue Subaru, like the one I'd seen at the trailhead when I'd arrived. My mouth went dry as pieces began to connect in my mind. I stepped closer, examining the map at the center of the display. Red pins marked various locations throughout the forest, with dates written beside each one. The most recent, dated just 2 weeks ago, was placed near the same lake I had camped beside. Next to the map hung a calendar, not an old one as I might have expected in an abandoned cabin, but current. Days had been X'd out, the last mark made on yesterday's date. Someone was using this cabin, recently, perhaps even now. A sound from outside, the snap of a branch, made me freeze. I turned slowly toward the open door, listening intently. The unnatural silence had returned, making the single sound stand out like a gunshot. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was time to go. I'd seen enough to know that something was very wrong here, that I needed to get back to my car and report this to the rangers or police. I turned to leave, and that's when I noticed something I'd overlooked when I entered. A trapdoor in the floor, partially concealed by a threadbare rug that had been pushed aside. It lay directly in my path to the exit. I considered going around it, hugging the wall to reach the door, but curiosity again got the better of caution. What was beneath this isolated cabin? A root cellar? A storage space? Or something worse? I knelt beside the trapdoor, finding an iron ring set into the wood. It lifted easily with a tug, revealing a square of absolute darkness below, and the top of a wooden ladder leading down. A cold draft wafted up from the opening, carrying that same metallic smell, stronger now. I took out my headlamp and switched it on, directing the beam into the darkness. The light revealed a dirt-walled cellar about 8 feet deep, larger than the cabin above, extending beyond the structure's footprint. The floor below was packed earth, and against the far wall stood a large wooden chest. But what made my blood run cold were the scratches on the cellar walls, thousands of them, covering every inch of earth. Not random marks, but words, names, dates. Some deeply etched, others faint, as if the person's strength had been failing as they carved. And directly below me at the bottom of the ladder lay a backpack. New, modern, with a university logo I recognized. Emma Larson's backpack. I nearly fell backward in shock and revulsion as the reality of what I was seeing hit me. This wasn't just some abandoned cabin. This was something far more sinister. Those newspaper clippings weren't a collection, they were trophies. I scrambled to my feet, no longer concerned with being quiet. I needed to get out, to get help. I turned toward the door and found it closed. I hadn't closed it, I was certain of that. But there it was, shut tight, the symbols on its surface seeming to writhe in the dim light of my headlamp. 3 quick steps brought me to the door. I grabbed the crude wooden handle and pulled. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, throwing my weight back. Nothing, as if it had been barred from the outside. Panic rose in my throat as I moved to the boarded window, searching for gaps large enough to squeeze through. The boards were nailed solidly, no space between them. I considered trying to kick them out, but the aged wood looked thick and solid. It would take time I wasn't sure I had. A sound from beneath me made me spin around, a soft scraping from the open trapdoor. I directed my headlamp toward it, the beam shaking with my trembling hand. Nothing visible, just the open square of the trapdoor and the darkness beyond. Then I heard it again, not from the cellar this time, but outside the cabin. That same tearing, rustling sound I'd heard in the fog the night before, moving around the perimeter of the structure. Stop, start, circling. I stood paralyzed, my back against the boarded window, as the sound completed a circuit of the cabin. When it reached the front again, it stopped. Silence fell, heavy and expectant. A new sound broke it, the distinct metallic slide of a bolt being drawn back on the other side of the door. The door began to open slowly, sunlight spilling into the dim interior in a widening rectangle. But it wasn't the light that made me press back against the wall in terror. It was what the light revealed standing in the doorway, a silhouette that made no sense to my brain, proportions all wrong, limbs too long and oddly jointed, head not where a head should be. Just like the stick figure on the stone, just like the symbol on the door. I think I screamed. I must have, because the sound that came back to me, a perfect mimicry of my own terrified voice, still haunts my nightmares. What happened next is confused in my memory. I remember a movement so fast it blurred. I remember pain as something struck my head. I remember falling, the trapdoor opening beneath me, the sensation of tumbling down into darkness. And then nothing. I woke in the cellar. How long I was unconscious, I don't know. Hours, based on the quality of the faint light coming through the open trapdoor above. My headlamp lay broken beside me, its lens shattered. My pack was gone. So were my hiking poles and boots. I lay on the packed earth in my socks, head throbbing where I'd been struck, mouth dry with thirst and fear. The wooden chest against the far wall was open now, its lid raised to reveal contents I couldn't make out in the dim light. I tried to stand but found my ankle wouldn't bear weight, sprained or broken in the fall. I crawled instead, dragging myself toward the ladder, desperate to reach the opening above. The ladder was gone. In its place hung a rope, dangling just out of my reach, even when I stretched to my full height, jumping despite the pain in my ankle. Someone had removed the ladder deliberately, leaving the rope as a taunt? A test? I sank back to the ground, mind racing. I needed to assess my situation clearly if I wanted to survive. I had no pack, no water, no food. My ankle was injured but not debilitating. The only exit was above me, unreachable for now. Night would be coming in a few hours and I had no light source. And something not fully human knew exactly where I was. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to fight back the panic threatening to overwhelm me. Panicking would only deplete my energy faster. I needed to think. First, I examined the cellar more carefully, crawling along the perimeter, running my hands over the earthen walls. The scratched names and dates were everywhere, some fresh-looking, others worn with age. I found one dated just 2 weeks earlier, Emma Larson, I assumed. The thought made me sick. The cellar extended well beyond the footprint of the cabin above, with rough tunneled extensions branching off in several directions. I followed one for about 20 feet before it became too narrow to continue. It seemed to be leading upward, perhaps an escape route dug by a previous captive, but abandoned when the effort grew too difficult. I returned to the main cellar, now barely visible in the fading light from above. The wooden chest called to me, but I hesitated to approach it. Whatever was inside, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Eventually, necessity overcame fear. It might contain something I could use to escape. I crawled toward it, reaching the open chest as the last of the daylight faded from the trapdoor opening. Inside, I found cloth, many layers of it, clothing. Using my hands in the near darkness, I discovered they were hiking clothes, different sizes, different styles, men's and women's both, all clean, neatly folded. At the bottom of the chest lay something hard and smooth. I lifted it out, a collection of small stones, each identical to the one in my pocket, each bearing the same symbol. I counted 23 of them. 23 stones. 23 missing persons in the newspaper clippings. I sat with my back against the dirt wall, the truth settling over me like the darkness. I wasn't the first to be trapped here. I wasn't even the most recent, based on the fresh marks on the wall and the news article about Emma Larson. I was just the newest addition to a long-established pattern. As full darkness fell, bringing with it an absolute blackness I've never experienced before or since, I heard a new sound from above. Not the rustling, tearing noise from before. Something else. Footsteps. Human footsteps, moving slowly across the cabin floor above me. Then a voice called down, a normal human voice, female and young-sounding. "Hello? Is someone down there? Are you hurt?" Hope surged through me, so powerfully it made me dizzy. "Yes," I called back. "I'm trapped! Please help me!" "Oh, thank God," the voice responded. "I thought I heard something. Hold on, I'm going to find a way to get you out." "The ladder's gone," I said. "There's a rope, but it's too high for me to reach." "I see it," she replied. Hold on, I think I can lower it." I heard scraping sounds, then the rope descended further, now hanging within my reach. I grabbed it eagerly, testing its strength with a tug. "Can you climb up?" she asked. "I'll help pull from this end." "My ankles hurt," I said, "but I think I can manage. What are you doing out here?" "I got lost," she said. "Been wandering for days. Found this cabin just before dark. Thank God I did, or I wouldn't have found you." Something about her story tickled at my consciousness, but relief overwhelmed suspicion. I grasped the rope and began to pull myself up, grimacing as pain shot through my injured ankle. The climb was awkward and painful, but the thought of rescue gave me strength I didn't know I had. As my head cleared the opening of the trapdoor, moonlight filtering through the boarded window revealed a young woman kneeling beside the opening, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, hiking clothes worn and dirty. Emma Larson, the missing hiker. "Alive! You're Emma," I gasped, pulling myself the rest of the way out of the cellar. "Everyone's looking for you." Her face registered surprise. "You know who I am?" "Your picture," I managed, rolling onto the floor and sitting up. "It was in the newspaper article, on the wall." I pointed, but in the dim moonlight, I couldn't make out the papered wall clearly. She looked where I pointed, then back at me, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "How long have you been down there?" "Since this morning," I said. Something attacked me. Something. I trailed off, uncertain how to describe what I'd seen in the doorway. She nodded slowly. "I know, they've been hunting me for 2 weeks." She moved to the cabin door, trying the handle. "Locked, just like I thought. The window, too." She turned back to me. "We need to find another way out before they come back." "They?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "How many are there?" "3 that I've seen," she said. "But there could be more." 3 lights across the lake, 3 circles around the figure on the stone. "What are they?" I whispered. She shook her head. "I don't know. Not human, not anything I've ever seen before. They can look human sometimes, sound human. That's how they—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. "How they what?" "How they lure you in," she finished, her voice barely audible. "They mimic voices, appearances, even memories somehow." I struggled to my feet, wincing as I put weight on my injured ankle. "We need to get out of here. I have a car at the North Trailhead, about 16 miles from here." 16 miles, she repeated, calculation in her voice. "With your ankle, it would take us at least 2 days, and they know these woods better than we do." "Better than being trapped here," I said, moving toward the door to examine it more closely. The heavy timber was secured with what looked like a serious deadbolt, not something we could break through easily. "There must be a key," I said, turning to scan the cabin's interior, "or something we can use to pry the boards off the window." Emma didn't respond immediately. When I turned back to her, she was staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "What?" I asked. "Your car," she said slowly. "You said it's at the North Trailhead, the small parking area with the information board?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Why?" "I left my Subaru there," she said. "Blue Subaru with Wisconsin plates." The hair on the back of my neck rose. "That's right," I said carefully. "I saw it when I pulled in." She continued to stare at me, her head tilting slightly in a way that suddenly seemed wrong. "How long ago did you start your hike, Thomas?" I hadn't told her my name. I took an involuntary step back, bumping into the table behind me. "I never told you my name," I whispered. A smile spread across her face, too wide, stretching beyond the normal limits of a human mouth. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming a multi-toned harmony of whispers. "You didn't have to, Thomas. We already knew it." I lunged for the door, desperate now, pulling at the handle with all my strength. It didn't budge. Behind me I heard movement, that same rustling, tearing sound coming now from what had appeared to be Emma Larson. I spun around, back pressed against the door, as the thing wearing Emma Larson's appearance began to change. In the dim moonlight filtering through cracks in the boarded window, I watched in horror as her form elongated, joints popping and skin stretching with that terrible tearing sound. Her head sank gradually into her shoulders, while her limbs extended impossibly, fingers lengthening into pale, jointed appendages too numerous to count. Throughout this nightmarish transformation, her eyes, now positioned in the upper chest where a collarbone should be, remained fixed on me, still recognizably human in an increasingly inhuman form. "We've been watching you, Thomas," the thing said, its voice still carrying echoes of Emma mixed with something ancient and cold. "Since you entered our forest. You felt us, didn't you? At your camp, by the lake." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Terror had frozen me completely as the creature continued its terrible reconfiguration, now standing nearly 7 feet tall, its proportions defying biological possibility. "The others thought we should take you immediately," it continued conversationally, taking a step toward me with a movement like flowing water. "But I convinced them to wait, to watch. I like to know who joins our collection." Collection. The word broke through my paralysis. The stones in the chest. The clothing, the newspaper clippings on the wall. "What did you do to them?" I managed to ask, my voice a strangled whisper. "To Emma? The others?" The thing tilted what passed for its upper body, regarding me with those misplaced eyes. "They contribute," it said simply, "as will you." It took another step forward. I frantically scanned the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. My gaze fell on the open trapdoor in the floor, the cellar from which I'd just escaped. It lay between me and the creature, a dark square opening in the floorboards. An idea formed through the panic, desperate, probably futile, but my only chance. I lunged suddenly to my right, away from the door, drawing the creature's attention. Then, summoning every ounce of strength I had, I charged directly at it, aiming for its midsection. The impact was like hitting a bag of wet sand, yielding yet solid, cold to the touch. The creature made a sound unlike anything I've ever heard, a high-pitched harmonic that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We both staggered backward, directly toward the open trapdoor. At the last moment, I twisted, throwing myself to the side. The creature, off balance from my attack, teetered at the edge of the opening, arms windmilling in a too-human gesture of surprise. Then it fell, its elongated form folding in on itself as it dropped into the darkness below. I didn't waste the opportunity. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle, and made for the door again. The deadbolt was heavy, industrial grade, but simple in design. I slid it open with trembling hands and pushed against the door. It swung outward into the night, and I nearly sobbed with relief at the sight of stars overhead. I stumbled out into the clearing, looking around frantically for which direction to flee. The lake gleamed dully to my right in the moonlight, which meant the trail back to my car would be. A piercing, multi-toned shriek erupted from the cabin behind me, followed by the sound of something fast climbing the dirt walls of the cellar. I'd bought myself seconds, not minutes. I took off into the forest, away from the lake, moving as quickly as my injured ankle would allow. The ground sloped upward here, the undergrowth thick and tangled, catching at my clothes and scratching my exposed skin. I pushed through it blindly, driven by pure survival instinct. Behind me, the shrieking stopped, replaced by that rustling, tearing sound, closer now, pursuing. It moved through the forest with uncanny speed, far faster than I could hope to outpace, especially injured. I needed a plan, a hiding place, anything. The ground continued its upward slope, becoming rockier. Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing what looked like a cliff face silhouetted against the night sky. I angled toward it, hoping to find a crevice or overhang to conceal myself. The sound behind me grew louder, closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and instantly regretted it. The thing moved through the forest like smoke given partial substance, flowing between trees rather than navigating around them. Its elongated form rippled in the moonlight, those too many limbs propelling it forward with horrifying efficiency. And behind it, I caught glimpses of other movement, 2 more shapes, similar but distinct, converging from different directions. 3 of them. Just as the false Emma had said, I reached the base of the cliff, scanning desperately for any kind of shelter. The rock face rose about 30 feet, nearly vertical in most places. To my left, a narrow fissure cut into the stone, just wide enough for a human to squeeze through. I didn't hesitate, throwing myself toward it and forcing my body into the opening. The crack extended about 6 feet into the cliff before making a sharp turn to the right. I pushed myself around this bend, finding the space widened into a small natural chamber, maybe 5 feet in diameter. The only way in or out was the narrow fissure I'd just navigated. Could they follow? The creature I'd seen could probably alter its shape enough to squeeze through, but would it? I pressed myself against the far wall of the little cave, trying to control my breathing, to make no sound. Seconds later, I heard them arrive outside. That rustling, tearing sound surrounded the entrance to my hiding place, punctuated by those high-pitched harmonic vocalizations, 3 distinct tones communicating in a language I couldn't comprehend. Then silence fell again, that unnatural quiet that seemed to absorb all sound. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement outside. A pale, elongated appendage snaked into the fissure, probing the narrow space. It looked almost like a human arm that had been stretched to twice its normal length. Fingers too long, too numerous, and jointed in too many places. The limb felt along the sides of the passage, searching. I pressed harder against the stone wall behind me, willing myself to disappear into it. The searching appendage reached the bend in the passage, hesitated, then began to withdraw. I nearly sagged with relief until I heard a scraping sound from above me. They were climbing the cliff face, searching for another entrance to my hiding place. I looked up but could see nothing in the absolute darkness of the small cave. Minutes passed, marked only by occasional sounds of movement outside and above. Then a shower of dirt and small stones fell from the ceiling of my little chamber, followed by a larger rock that barely missed my head. They were digging down from above. I had to move, had to find another way out. But the only exit was the narrow fissure, now almost certainly guarded by at least one of the creatures. I was trapped. More dirt fell. Then a shaft of moonlight pierced the darkness as a hole opened in the ceiling of the cave. I caught a glimpse of one of those 2 long limbs before I pressed myself into the corner farthest from the new opening, making myself as small as possible. A face appeared in the hole, or something like a face. In the poor light, I could make out only a suggestion of features. Eyes where they shouldn't be, an opening that might have been a mouth but oriented vertically rather than horizontally. It saw me. I knew it saw me. But instead of attacking, it withdrew, and the harmonic vocalizations resumed outside, more excited now. They were discussing me, deciding what to do with me. In that moment of relative quiet, I became aware of something else, a sound so faint I might have imagined it. A steady dripping from somewhere in the back of the small cave. Water. I felt along the wall behind me, finding a narrow crack from which moisture seeped. Following it downward, my fingers encountered a gap at the base of the wall, a space perhaps a foot high where the floor of the cave didn't quite meet the back wall. Air moved through this gap. Flowing air meant another opening somewhere. Without hesitation, I dropped to my stomach and began to wriggle into the space, using my elbows to pull myself forward. The gap widened slightly after the first few feet, allowing me to move more easily. I crawled blindly, ignoring the pain in my injured ankle, focusing only on moving forward, away from the creatures behind me. The tunnel, if you could call it that, descended at a gentle angle, twisting occasionally. I had no idea how far I'd gone or in what direction when I heard a renewed commotion from behind me. They'd discovered my escape route. I increased my pace, ignoring the rocks that dug into my elbows and knees, the cold water that now flowed along the bottom of the passage, soaking my clothes. The sound of pursuit grew louder, that rustling, tearing noise now accompanied by a rapid, multi-limbed movement that reminded me of a centipede. The passage continued its descent, the flow of water increasing. The air grew damper, heavy with mineral scents. I was deep underground now, in what must be a natural drainage system for the cliff above. Suddenly, the narrow tunnel opened into a larger space, a cavern of some kind, though I could see nothing in the absolute darkness. The sound of flowing water was louder here, echoing from multiple directions. I paused, completely blind, unsure which way to go. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. I had seconds, not minutes. Instinct took over. I turned toward the loudest water sound and began to crawl in that direction. The ground sloped more steeply now, the water flowing faster around my hands and knees. The passage narrowed again, the ceiling dropping until I was forced to lie almost flat, pulling myself forward with my fingertips. Then the ground fell away beneath me. I slid down a slick chute of stone, helpless to slow my descent, water rushing around me from all sides now. The chute twisted, turned, dropped again. I was falling, sliding, being carried along by the underground stream that had found its way through fissures in the rock. I had just enough time to gulp a breath before plunging into deeper water, a pool or underground lake, impossible to tell in the darkness. The cold hit me like a physical blow, shocking enough that I nearly gasped and inhaled water. I forced myself to hold my breath, kicking upward toward what I hoped was the surface. My head broke into air, and I gasped, coughing and sputtering. The sound echoed strangely, suggesting a large open space. But the darkness remained absolute. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I tread water, trying to orient myself. The current pulled gently in one direction, and I could hear water flowing somewhere ahead. With no better option, I began to swim with the current, hoping it would lead to an exit. How long I swam through that underground river, I couldn't say. Time lost all meaning in the absolute darkness. My clothes dragged at me, making each stroke an effort. My injured ankle throbbed with each kick, but I kept moving, following the current, letting it guide me. Eventually, I noticed a change. The darkness was no longer absolute. A faint, very faint grayish light seemed to permeate the water ahead. I swam toward it with renewed energy. The passage widened, the ceiling rose, and suddenly I could make out shapes in the water around me. Rock formations, the walls of the cavern. The light grew stronger, taking on a bluish quality that I recognized with a surge of hope. Daylight filtered through water. I rounded a bend in the underground river and saw it, a shimmering surface ahead where the cavern opened to the outside world. A few more strokes brought me to this opening, a half-submerged arch about 4 feet wide, beyond which I could see open sky. I pulled myself through the narrow exit, emerging into a small pond surrounded by trees. Early morning sunlight filtered through the branches above, the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I dragged myself onto the shore, collapsing on the muddy bank, too exhausted to go any further. I had escaped, for now. As my racing heart slowed and rational thought returned, I realized I had no idea where I was. The underground river could have carried me miles from the cabin, in any direction. I had no pack, no map, no compass, no food. My clothes were soaked, my body bruised and cut in countless places, my ankle swollen to twice its normal size. But I was alive, and in daylight, things always seem more manageable. I forced myself to my feet, using a branch as a makeshift walking stick. The sun was just clearing the trees to my left, which meant it was rising in the east. My car was at the north trailhead. If I could maintain a northward direction and eventually find a trail, I might make it back to civilization. I set off, limping heavily, using the sun to orient myself. The forest here was different from where I'd been hiking. Older, the trees larger and more widely spaced, with less undergrowth. It made travel easier, despite my injured ankle. I walked for hours, stopping occasionally to rest and to wring more water from my clothes. The day warmed gradually, helping to dry my sodden clothing and lifting my spirits slightly. I saw no signs of the creatures, heard nothing but normal forest sounds. Perhaps they couldn't follow where I'd gone. Perhaps they were limited to a certain territory, or perhaps they simply didn't need to pursue. Perhaps they knew these woods so well that they could predict where I would emerge, where I would go. This thought kept me moving despite growing exhaustion and hunger. By midday, I'd covered perhaps 3 miles, painfully slow progress, but movement nonetheless. Then, miraculously, I stumbled upon a trail. Not a major one, just a narrow footpath, but clearly human-made and maintained. I nearly cried with relief. The trail ran roughly east-west, not ideal for my northward goal, but any path was better than none. I decided to follow it west, reasoning that most trails in the area eventually connected to larger ones leading to trailheads. The gamble paid off. After another hour of painful hiking, the trail intersected a wider, more established path with actual trail markers. and there, on a wooden sign pointing north, were the words, North Trailhead, 4.2 miles. 4 miles. Under normal circumstances, a pleasant afternoon stroll. In my current condition, it might as well have been 40, but I had no choice. I turned north and continued my limping progress, leaning heavily on my makeshift walking stick, driven forward by the thought of my car, of escape, of putting this forest far behind me. The hours blurred together as I focused solely on placing one foot in front of the other. The trail climbed, descended, wound around outcroppings of rock and fallen trees. My injured ankle screamed with each step, but I ignored it, pushing through the pain. As the afternoon waned, the quality of light changing as the sun lowered toward the western horizon, I began to recognize landmarks from my hike in that distinctive lightning-struck pine, the small brook crossing with stepping stones arranged in an arc. I was getting close. The final mile was both the easiest and the hardest. Easiest because I knew exactly where I was, hardest because exhaustion and pain had reached nearly unbearable levels. I stumbled more than walked, fell several times, pulled myself back up using my walking stick and pure force of will. And then as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the path, I rounded a final bend and saw it. The small, cleared area of the trailhead parking lot. And in it, my car. And beside my car, the blue Subaru with Wisconsin plates. I froze, staring at the two vehicles. Emma Larson's car was still there, exactly as I'd seen it when I arrived, which meant the sound came from behind me, that now familiar rustling, tearing noise. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. They stood at the edge of the clearing, three elongated figures partially concealed by the trees, their forms seeming to shift and flow even when stationary. They made no move to approach, simply watched me with eyes positioned in all the wrong places. I was so close. My car was right there, keys in the front pocket of my sodden pants. I could make it across the clearing, get inside, start the engine, be gone from this place in seconds, if they allowed it. For a long moment, we remained frozen in tableau, me at the edge of the parking area, them at the edge of the forest, my car tantalizingly close, yet unreachable, without turning my back on them. Then the central figure moved, not toward me, but back, retreating a step into the deeper shadows of the forest. The others followed suit, melting into the gathering darkness beneath the trees. They were letting me go. I didn't question it, didn't hesitate. I limped across the parking lot as quickly as my injured ankle would allow, fumbling my keys from my pocket with trembling hands. I unlocked the car, threw myself inside, locked the doors again immediately. As I jammed the key into the ignition and the engine roared to life, I allowed myself one final glance toward the forest edge. They were gone, or at least no longer visible, but I felt their presence, knew they were still watching from the shadows. I threw the car into reverse, backed out of the parking space, then shifted to drive and accelerated down the gravel access road, tires spitting stones behind me. I didn't slow until I reached the paved highway, then turned toward town and pushed the speedometer well beyond the legal limit. It was fully dark by the time I reached civilization, the small town nearest the forest, its streetlights and illuminated windows, the most welcoming sight imaginable. I pulled into the first motel I saw, parked haphazardly across two spaces, and limped into the office. The elderly clerk looked up in alarm as I entered, and I realized what a sight I must be, soaked, muddy, limping, wild-eyed with exhaustion and lingering terror. "Good Lord, son," he said, rising from his chair. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. What could I say that wouldn't sound completely insane? "Hiking accident," I managed. "Got lost. Need a room." He didn't ask questions, just nodded and went through the check-in process with remarkable efficiency. Minutes later, I was in a small but clean room, the door locked and chained behind me. I showered mechanically, watching dirt and blood swirl down the drain, wincing as hot water found countless scratches and cuts I hadn't even been aware of. My ankle was badly swollen, deeply bruised, but probably not broken. I could still put weight on it, just barely. Wrapped in the motel's thin towel, I collapsed onto the bed and fell immediately into a deep, dreamless sleep, the sleep of complete physical and mental exhaustion. I awoke to sunlight streaming through thin curtains, momentarily disoriented before the events of the previous day came rushing back. I sat up quickly, irrationally afraid that I'd find myself back in the forest, back in that cabin. But no, I was still in the motel room, still safe. For now. I dressed in my still damp clothes, grimacing at their condition, but having no alternatives. My ankle had stiffened overnight, making walking even more difficult. I needed medical attention, needed to report what had happened, needed to warn others about the dangers in that forest. But first, I needed to understand what had actually occurred, to convince myself I hadn't simply suffered some kind of breakdown or hallucination. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small stone I'd found in the cabin. It was still there, still real, the perfectly circular shape, the etched symbol of the headless figure surrounded by 3 circles, proof that what I'd experienced had been real, not imagined. At the motel office, I asked the clerk for directions to the nearest police station. He gave them readily, along with a concerned look at my obvious injuries, but again asked no questions. The local police station was a small building on the town's main street, staffed by a young officer who looked up from his computer as I limped in. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, taking in my appearance with professional assessment. "I need to report." I hesitated. "What exactly? A kidnapping? An attack? An encounter with entities unknown to science?" "A situation in the forest," I finished lamely. The officer, his nameplate read Jenkins, motioned me to a chair beside his desk. "What kind of situation?" I took a deep breath, then told him everything. The cabin, the newspaper clippings, Emma Larson's backpack, the creatures. I spoke for nearly 30 minutes, the officer taking notes without comment, his expression giving nothing away. When I finished, pushing the stone across the desk as physical evidence, Officer Jenkins sat back and studied me for a long moment. "Mr. Carlton," he said finally, using the name I'd given him, "that's quite a story." I bristled at his tone. "It's not a story. It happened. Check the North Trailhead parking lot. Emma Larson's car is still there. And there's a cabin near Alpine Lake that's not on any map, filled with evidence of missing hikers." Jenkins nodded slowly. "We're aware of Miss Larson's vehicle, sir. In fact, we've been conducting search operations in that area for 2 weeks. Haven't found any sign of her, or any cabin like you're describing." "It's there," I insisted. "About half a mile from the eastern shore of Alpine Lake. And these things, whatever they are, they've been taking people. For years, maybe decades." The officer picked up the stone I'd pushed across his desk, examining it briefly before setting it down. "And you believe these entities captured you, but then just let you go. Why would they do that?" It was a good question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly during the night. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe they were toying with me. Maybe they've done this before. Let someone escape to spread the story, create fear." Jenkins nodded again, his expression neutral but skeptical. "Mr. Carlton, I'm going to be honest with you. What you're describing sounds like the result of exposure and injury in the wilderness, hallucinations induced by fear, dehydration, and possible concussion." "I wasn't hallucinating," I said firmly. "Nevertheless," he continued, "I'd like to have you checked out at the medical center before we proceed further. Your injuries are real and they need attention." I wanted to argue, to make him understand the danger, but exhaustion was catching up with me again. And he was right about one thing. I did need medical attention. "Fine," I agreed reluctantly. "But will you at least check out the cabin and the area around it?" "We'll continue our search efforts for Miss Larson," he said carefully. "And I'll file your report, including the details about this cabin. But I need to be clear. We've had teams combing that area for 2 weeks. If this structure existed as you describe it, we would have found it by now." But they wouldn't have, I realized. Not if the creatures didn't want them to. Officer Jenkins drove me to the small local medical center himself, helping me inside and explaining my situation to the intake nurse. I was examined, diagnosed with a severe ankle sprain, dehydration, and numerous minor injuries, but no sign of concussion or other head trauma that might explain hallucinations. I was kept overnight for observation and rehydration via IV. During that time, I overheard Jenkins speaking with the doctor outside my room, their voices low but audible through the partially open door. "Shows no signs of drug use or psychosis," the doctor was saying. "His injuries are consistent with his story of getting lost and falling, but not consistent with his claims of being attacked by non-human entities. Jenkins replied dryly. Well, no, the doctor admitted. But trauma can do strange things to the mind. People rationalize extreme experiences in unexpected ways. I closed my eyes, suddenly too tired to be angry at their dismissal. Let them think I was crazy or confused. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The next morning, feeling somewhat restored after proper hydration and rest, I was discharged with crutches, pain medication, and referrals to follow up with my regular doctor. Officer Jenkins was waiting for me. I've made some calls, he said as he drove me back to my car at the motel. There's no record of a permanent structure near Alpine Lake. The entire area is protected forest, no private holdings, no historical cabins. The Forest Service keeps pretty meticulous records of these things. It's there, I insisted again. And those things are out there too, taking people. Jenkins sighed. Mr. Carlton, we take missing persons cases very seriously. But what you're suggesting, some kind of non-human predators systematically abducting hikers, it's just not supported by any evidence beyond your own traumatic experience. What about Emma Larson? I demanded. And the others in those newspaper clippings? People get lost in wilderness areas every year, he said evenly. They make mistakes, get disoriented, suffer accidents. It's tragic, but it happens. There's no need to invoke supernatural explanations. I realized I was getting nowhere. To Jenkins, I was just another hiker who'd gotten into trouble and whose mind had created a fantastic explanation for a frightening experience. Without hard evidence I couldn't provide since I'd barely escaped with my life, I couldn't convince him or anyone else. At the motel, Jenkins helped me into my own car and handed me my crutches. Take care of yourself, Mr. Carlton, and maybe stick to more populated hiking trails in the future. I nodded wordlessly, watching in the rearview mirror as he drove away. Then I sat in my car for a long time, thinking, planning. I couldn't just leave, couldn't just go home and try to forget what had happened. People were in danger. Emma Larson was almost certainly dead, but there would be others. There would always be others as long as those things were out there, hunting. But what could I do? Return to the forest alone, injured? Try to convince others to help me search for a cabin that apparently couldn't be found by professional search teams? Report my experience to higher authorities who would be even less likely to believe me than Officer Jenkins had been? In the end, I did the only thing I could. I drove home, slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to rest my still foggy head and aching body. My apartment felt both strange and comforting when I finally arrived, everything exactly as I'd left it 5 days ago, yet somehow altered by my own transformation from the person who had left to the person now returning. I showered again, more thoroughly this time, and examined my injuries in the bathroom mirror. Bruises in various stages of development covered much of my body. Scratches and cuts crisscrossed my arms and legs. My ankle, professionally wrapped now, throbbed dully beneath its bandage. But it was my eyes that showed the most change, haunted, wary, belonging to someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen, known things that couldn't be unknown. I slept for nearly 20 hours straight, waking only to take pain medication and use the bathroom. When I finally emerged from this healing coma, my mind was clearer, my resolve strengthened. I couldn't fight those things directly. Whatever they were, they had advantages in their forest territory that no human could overcome. But I could document, could warn others, could perhaps prevent future disappearances. I spent the next several days researching, using my laptop to search for any information about the Checkamega-Nicolet Forest and unusual occurrences there. I found more missing persons cases than I expected, dozens over the past 50 years, many unsolved, some in the same general area where I'd been hiking. I searched for references to strange creatures, to unexplained lights, to isolated cabins. Most results were typical cryptid folklore or campfire tales, nothing specific to that forest or matching what I'd experienced. I created a map marking the locations of disappearances where they were specified in news reports. A pattern emerged, a roughly circular area about 10 miles in diameter, centered approximately on Alpine Lake, the same area where I'd encountered the creatures. I tried to contact families of the missing, hoping to gather more information to see if anyone else had reported similar experiences before disappearing. Most didn't respond to my emails. Those who did were suspicious, even hostile. They dealt with enough crackpots and conspiracy theorists exploiting their tragedies. I couldn't blame them. In their position, I would have reacted the same way. A week after my return, I received a call from Officer Jenkins. "Mr. Carlton," he said when I answered, his voice professional but with an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "I wanted to follow up on your report." "Did you find the cabin?" I asked immediately. "Or any sign of those creatures?" A pause. "No," he said finally. "We've continued searching the area around Alpine Lake as part of the ongoing effort to locate Ms. Larson. No structures have been found. No unusual tracks or signs of the entities you described." "They wouldn't leave obvious signs," I said, frustrated but not surprised. "And the cabin, it might not be visible unless they want it to be. It sounds crazy, I know, but—" "Actually," Jenkins interrupted, "that's not why I'm calling. We did find something else, something that might interest you." My pulse quickened. "What?" "Previous reports," he said. "Going back decades, hikers who made it out of the forest with stories similar to yours. Unusual lights, disorientation, encounters with beings they couldn't properly describe. Most were dismissed as hallucinations brought on by exposure, just as—" He trailed off. "Just as you dismissed mine," I finished for him. "Yes," he admitted. "These reports were buried in old files, most from before computerized record-keeping. I only found them because your story seemed familiar somehow, made me curious enough to dig through the archives." I sat down, a mixture of vindication and dread washing over me. "How many reports?" 17 that I've found so far," Jenkins said. "Dating back to 1958, all describing encounters in roughly the same area of the forest, all mentioning lights, unnatural silence, strange figures watching from the trees." "And a cabin?" I pressed. "Did any of them find a cabin?" Another pause. 3 did, he confirmed, each describing it slightly differently, but in approximately the same location you indicated. "But Mr. Carlton, search teams have repeatedly combed that area over the years after these reports. No structure has ever been found." "Because it's not always there," I said, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. "Or it's not fully there, like the creatures themselves. They can appear and disappear, can change form. The cabin is part of their hunting technique, their territory." Jenkins was silent for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, less official. "I've been with the department for 12 years. Grew up in this town. My whole life there have been stories about that part of the forest. Places where compasses don't work right. Hikers who come out telling crazy stories if they come out at all. Most of us who live here, we avoid that area." "But you don't warn visitors," I said, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. "You let people like me, like Emma Larson, hike into that area not knowing the danger." "What would we say?" Jenkins asked, sounding genuinely conflicted. "That we have unconfirmed reports of supernatural entities? That would either cause panic or ridicule. We do mark trails in that area as advanced, recommend hiking in groups. The Forest Service regularly sweeps for hazards. What more can we do without evidence?" He had a point, I had to admit. No one would take seriously the kind of warning that might actually save lives. "I'm sorry about what happened to you out there," Jenkins continued, "and I'm sorry I didn't take your report more seriously initially, but without hard evidence—" "I understand," I said, and I did. "Thank you for calling, for looking into those old reports. At least I know I'm not crazy." "No," he agreed quietly. "I don't think you are." He paused. "One more thing. Those previous reports? Almost all of them mentioned a small stone with a strange symbol, just like the one you showed me." My hand went automatically to my pocket, where I'd been carrying the stone since my return. "What happened to those people? The ones who reported encounters like mine?" Jenkins hesitated before answering. "Most left the area soon after. Changed jobs, moved away. A few disappeared later, months or years after their initial encounters." A chill ran through me. "Disappeared how?" "Various ways," he said carefully. "Car accidents where the body wasn't recovered. Apparent drownings where no one witnessed the event. One house fire. Nothing that couldn't be explained naturally, but together a pattern, a continuation of what had begun in the forest." "They don't just let people go, do they?" I said softly. "They follow. They wait. They collect." Jenkins didn't answer directly. "Be careful, Mr. Carlton," he said instead. Whatever you experienced out there, maybe it's not over. After we hung up, I sat motionless for a long time, Jenkins' words echoing in my mind. Maybe it's not over. I thought about the stone in my pocket, the symbol it bore, the headless figure surrounded by 3 circles, a marker, perhaps, a tag, property claimed but not yet collected. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in my apartment building, doors closing, water running through pipes, the hum of the heating system, seemed magnified, threatening. I found myself checking the locks repeatedly, peering through windows into the darkness outside. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, that soft, tearing, rustling sound, coming from directly outside my bedroom window. I froze, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard across the room. The sound continued, moving slowly along the exterior wall of my 3rd-floor apartment, an impossible location for any normal creature. Then came a gentle tapping on the glass. 3 distinct taps, evenly spaced. An invitation, a reminder. I didn't approach the window, didn't pull back the curtains to see what waited on the other side. I stayed perfectly still until dawn brought tentative light through the curtains. Only then did I approach the window, heart still hammering in my chest, and carefully pull back the edge of the fabric to peer outside. Nothing was there, just the ordinary view of the parking lot 3 stories below. But on the glass itself, visible now in the growing light, were 3 perfect handprints. Not made of dirt or dust or any substance I could identify. They appeared to be etched into the glass itself, the surface frosted in the shape of elongated fingers. Too many joints, too many digits. I backed away from the window, panic rising in my throat. They knew where I lived. They could reach me here, in what I had foolishly considered a safe haven. I had to leave, immediately. Within an hour, I had packed a single suitcase with essentials: clothes, toiletries, my laptop, important documents, and what cash I had on hand. I left most of my belongings behind, caring only about getting away quickly. As I threw the suitcase into my car and slid behind the wheel, I caught sight of my neighbor Mrs. Abernathy watching from her balcony with concern. I forced a smile and waved, pretending everything was normal. The last thing I needed was the police being called because someone thought I was having a mental breakdown. I had no specific destination in mind as I pulled onto the highway, only the desperate need to put distance between myself and what had visited my window during the night. I drove west, reasoning that if these entities were tied to that specific forest in Wisconsin, perhaps crossing state lines would help. It didn't occur to me until I was halfway across Minnesota that running might be exactly what they expected, what they wanted. Isolation had always been part of their hunting technique. Cut the prey off from the herd, drive it into unfamiliar territory, then move in for the kill. But what alternative did I have? Stay in my apartment, waiting for the next visitation? Try to fight creatures I barely understood, with abilities beyond human comprehension? I checked into a motel outside Fargo, North Dakota that evening, exhausted from driving all day with my still healing injuries. The small, anonymous room offered little comfort, but I engaged every lock, wedged a chair under the doorknob, and kept the bathroom light on all night. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by every small noise from neighboring rooms or the parking lot outside. Each time I jerked awake, I found myself instinctively checking the windows for those frost-etched handprints. Morning brought no evidence of nocturnal visitors. Perhaps I had gained some distance, some respite. I continued westward, crossing into Montana by mid-afternoon, the vast open spaces of the American West seeming to offer some psychological protection. It was harder to imagine being stalked in these wide-open plains and prairies where one could see for miles in every direction. I settled in Bozeman, a college town nestled against the Rocky Mountains. It felt right somehow, surrounded by different forests, different mountains than those that had nearly claimed my life. I found a small furnished apartment with month-to-month leasing, using some of my savings to pay 2 months up front, no questions asked. For a while, it seemed to work. October passed without incident. My ankle healed, though it still ached when rain approached. I found part-time work at a local outdoor equipment store, an irony not lost on me, using my extensive knowledge of camping and hiking gear even as I avoided ever setting foot on a trail again. I made no friends, formed no attachments. I told people I was just passing through, taking a sabbatical from real life to explore the West. No one questioned this. Bozeman was full of transients and wanderers. Each night before bed, I removed the small stone from my pocket and placed it on the nightstand beside me. A reminder, a talisman, almost. I found I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, though I wasn't sure if I kept it as evidence of my experience or if some deeper compulsion prevented me from discarding it. The first snow fell in early November, transforming Bozeman into a winter postcard. I watched from my apartment window as students engaged in impromptu snowball fights in the street below, their laughter carrying up to me like echoes from another world, a carefree world I had once inhabited but could no longer access. That night, I dreamed of the forest for the first time since my escape. In the dream, I was back at Alpine Lake, watching the strange lights across the water. But this time, instead of staying at my campsite, I found myself walking into the lake, the cold water rising around me as I moved deeper, drawn toward the lights. They multiplied as I approached, dozens of them now, forming patterns that almost resembled written language. A message I could almost understand. I awoke to the sound of tapping on glass. 3 distinct taps, evenly spaced. My room was pitch black. The power was out, I realized, the digital clock beside the bed dark and silent. The tapping came again, from the window behind the blinds. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. Fear paralyzed me completely. I couldn't move, couldn't call out, could barely breathe as I strained to see in the darkness. The stone on my nightstand seemed to gleam with a faint internal light, the etched symbol casting impossible shadows on the ceiling above. The tapping stopped. Silence fell, that unnatural silence I remembered from the forest, as if all sound had been absorbed from the world. Then came a whisper directly beside my ear. "Thomas." I jerked upright with a strangled cry, scrambling across the bed away from the voice. My back hit the opposite wall as I fumbled for the lamp, the switch, anything to bring light. Nothing happened. The power remained out. Through the blinds, I could see that the entire street was dark. Not a single light visible in neighboring buildings or streetlights. "Thomas, we've been patient." The voice came from a different corner of the room now, still whispering but clearly audible. I couldn't see anything, couldn't locate its source in the absolute darkness. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my own voice sounding thin and weak in the smothering silence. "You know what we want." Now the voice seemed to come from directly above me, from the ceiling. "You're one of ours now. You've been marked." "I won't go back to the forest," I said, trying to sound defiant despite my terror. "You can't make me." A sound that might have been laughter rippled through the room, a high, harmonic series of tones that set my teeth on edge. "We don't need to." The voice was everywhere now, surrounding me. "We are wherever you go. We are patient. We have time. Sooner or later, you will come to us. They all do." The stone on my nightstand flared suddenly brighter, its internal luminescence growing until it cast the room in an eerie, blue-white glow. By this light, I could finally see them. 3 elongated figures stationed around my bed, their forms seeming to bend and flow even when still, their misplaced eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that felt ancient and cold. I screamed then, a sound of pure animal terror that tore from my throat without conscious thought. I lunged for the door, no plan beyond escape, beyond getting away from those watching eyes. My hand closed on the doorknob, turned it, pulled, and the door opened onto absolute darkness. Not the hallway of my apartment building, but a void, a nothingness that seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. I slammed the door shut, spun around to face the room again. The 3 figures had moved closer, now forming a semicircle between me and the window, my only other potential escape route. "No need to run, Thomas," one said, its voice resonating with multiple tones. "You've always been running toward us, not away, since the moment you found the stone." "I don't understand," I gasped, pressing my back against the door. "Why me? Why any of us?" The central figure tilted its elongated form in what might have been a shrug. "Why does a wolf hunt deer? Why does a spider build a web? We are what we are. You are what you are. Pray." "But you let me go," I said, desperately seeking to understand, to find some logic I could use to negotiate my survival. "You could have taken me in the forest, but you let me leave." "The hunt is long," another answered, this voice slightly higher in pitch. "The collection grows slowly, Some we take quickly, others we savor. The fear sustains us as much as the final consumption. The third figure moved closer, its too many limbs making soft rustling sounds against the floor. You have been especially delicious, Thomas. Your fear has flavored our existence for weeks now, but all hunts must end. I felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room, a gathering of purpose, of finality. They were done talking, done waiting. In desperation, I lunged for the stone on the nightstand, grabbing it and holding it up like a talisman. "Stay back!" I shouted, having no idea if the object held any power but clinging to it nonetheless. The creatures hesitated, their forms seeming to ripple with something almost like amusement. "You still don't understand," the central figure said. "The stone is not protection. It is connection, our mark upon you, our claim." And with that, the stone in my hand began to grow warm, then hot, its inner light intensifying until I had to squint against its brightness. The symbol etched into its surface, the headless figure surrounded by 3 circles, began to move, to writhe as if alive. I tried to drop the stone, but found I couldn't open my hand. The rock seemed to be merging with my flesh, burning into my palm. Pain shot up my arm as the symbol began to transfer itself from stone to skin, etching into my flesh with fiery precision. I screamed again, falling to my knees as the agony intensified. The 3 figures moved closer, surrounding me completely now, their elongated limbs reaching toward me with almost ritualistic slowness. "You are ours," they intoned in unison, their voices blending into a harmonic chord that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "You have always been ours." The stone grew hotter still, the pain unbearable now. My vision began to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges as consciousness started to slip away. The last thing I saw was the 3 figures bending over me, their misplaced eyes gleaming with ancient hunger, their too many limbs reaching to gather me up. Then, nothing. I awoke to sunlight and normalcy. My apartment in Bozeman, morning light streaming through the blinds, the digital clock beside the bed showing 7:28 a.m. No sign of the night's visitation. I sat up slowly, half expecting pain or injury, but finding none. My hand, the one that had held the burning stone, showed no mark, no symbol etched into the flesh. It looked completely normal. The stone itself sat innocuously on the nightstand, just as I had placed it the night before. No inner light, no moving symbols, just an ordinary piece of rock with a crude etching on its surface. Had it been just a nightmare? A particularly vivid episode of PTSD from my experience in the forest? I wanted desperately to believe that. But as I rose and moved through my morning routine, a deep uneasiness remained. The dream, if it had been a dream, felt too real, too consistent with my experiences in the forest. And there was something else, something subtle but wrong. The apartment felt different somehow. The quality of light, the sounds from outside, the very air itself, all slightly off, as if everything had been shifted a few degrees from reality. I approached the window cautiously and raised the blinds to look outside. Bozeman greeted me, snow-covered streets, students hurrying to morning classes, cars moving carefully along slippery roads, everything exactly as it should be. Except, I didn't recognize the building across the street. Where there should have been a small coffee shop was now a vintage clothing store I had never seen before. And the street itself seemed wider somehow, the perspective slightly altered. Heart pounding, I moved to the apartment door and opened it. The hallway beyond looked normal, the same faded carpet, the same numbered doors of neighboring units. But the emergency exit sign at the end of the corridor, which had always been red, now glowed a pale blue-white, the same color as the light that had emanated from the stone. I closed the door quickly, leaning against it as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I still dreaming? Hallucinating? Or was something far more fundamental occurring? Something beyond my capacity to fully comprehend. I needed to ground myself, to test reality. I picked up my phone from beside the bed and dialed Jenkins, the police officer who had helped me, who had believed me. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before being answered. "Chequamegon County Sheriff's Department," said a voice that was almost but not quite Jenkins. "Officer Jenkins, please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry, sir, there's no one by that name working here," the almost Jenkins voice replied. "Perhaps you want the city police instead of the county?" I hung up, a cold sensation spreading through my chest. I tried another number, my former employer back in Wisconsin. Again, someone answered who sounded almost right, but subtly wrong, and claimed no knowledge of me or my previous position there. With growing desperation, I called my parents' number. My mother answered, her voice so familiar it nearly brought tears to my eyes. "Mom," I said urgently. "It's me, Thomas." A pause. "I think you have the wrong number," she said, her voice confused but polite. "There's no Thomas here." "Mom, it's me, your son," I insisted, panic rising. "Thomas Carlton, born May 12, 1990. Please, you have to remember me." "I'm sorry," she said, sounding genuinely disturbed now. "My only son is named Daniel. I think you should—" I hung up, the phone slipping from suddenly numb fingers. This couldn't be happening. I existed. I had a life, a history, people who knew me. Didn't I? With shaking hands, I opened my laptop and navigated to social media. My profiles were gone. Email accounts I had used for years returned user not found errors. Searches for my name yielded results for other Thomas Carltons. None of them me. In growing desperation, I pulled out my wallet, checking my driver's license. The photo was mine, the name was mine, but the address listed was the cabin in the forest, not any place I had ever actually lived. I was being erased. Or I had never existed at all. Or, most terrifying of all, I existed now in some other reality, some parallel world where everything was almost the same but fundamentally, crucially different. The stone on the nightstand seemed to pulse once, drawing my attention back to it. I approached cautiously, not touching it but leaning close to examine the etched symbol. It had changed. The headless figure was the same, but now there were 4 circles surrounding it, not 3. I staggered back, understanding finally dawning with horrible clarity. This had happened before, to others, to those who had escaped the forest only to disappear later in ways that couldn't be explained naturally, as Jenkins had put it. They hadn't killed me in the forest. They hadn't killed me in my apartment last night. They had done something far worse. They had pulled me across some barrier between worlds, into a reality almost identical to my own, but subtly, irrevocably altered. A reality where Thomas Carlton had never existed, where even my own mother didn't recognize me. In this world, I was truly alone, isolated, cut off from any help or connection, perfect prey. The revelation left me reeling, collapsing into the chair by the window as I struggled to process the impossible. If I wasn't in my reality anymore, where exactly was I? Some pocket dimension created by the creatures? A parallel universe they could somehow access? Or was this still my world but altered according to their incomprehensible abilities? And more importantly, could I get back? I spent the next several days in a state of functional shock, going through the motions of life while trying to understand my situation. My apartment key still worked. My car was still in the parking lot where I'd left it. I could still buy groceries with my credit card, interact with people who treated me as real and present. But I had been erased from history, from memory. No one remembered me from before my arrival in Bozeman. According to records I managed to access, Thomas Carlton had only existed for about 2 months, exactly the time I'd been in Montana. I found myself carrying the stone everywhere, unable to leave it behind despite knowing it was somehow connected to my predicament. It felt important, essential even, as if it were the only real thing linking me to my true reality. The symbol continued to change subtly. The 4 circles became 5, then 6, though the headless figure remained constant. I began to understand it as a kind of countdown, though to what, I couldn't say. A week after my transition, as I had come to think of it, I noticed another change in my new reality. People didn't quite look at me directly anymore. Shop clerks would conduct entire transactions with their eyes focused slightly to my left or right. Pedestrians on the street would unconsciously move around me, giving me a wide berth without ever acknowledging my presence. I was becoming liminal, peripheral, fading from this reality just as I had been erased from my own. And at night they came, not physically, as they had in what I now thought of as the final night in my real world, but in dreams, in shadows, in the corner of my vision. 3 elongated figures, watching, waiting, their patience infinite and their purpose unwavering. I began to understand that this was the true hunt, not the physical chase through the forest, but this slow, psychological wearing down, this gradual isolation and erasure until the prey was so completely alone that final collection could occur without risk of interference or witness. The stone now showed 7 circles around the headless figure. I sensed I was running out of time. In desperation, I decided to return to the forest. Not the forest of this altered reality, but the one from my own world. If there was any hope of reversing what had been done to me, it would be there, at the source. I packed minimally, taking only what I would need for the journey: clothes, some food, the stone. Before leaving my apartment for what I suspected would be the final time, I sat down at my laptop and began to type this account. I don't know if anyone will ever read these words, if they'll remain in this reality once I'm gone, or if they'll fade like all other evidence of my existence. But I need to leave some record, some warning to others who might encounter what I did in those woods. If you're reading this, and if you ever find yourself in the northern reaches of the Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest in Wisconsin, stay away from Alpine Lake. Stay away from any isolated cabin you might stumble upon. And if you see lights in the forest at night, strange figures moving among the trees, run. Run and don't look back. But most importantly, if you find a small, circular stone with a strange symbol etched upon it, a headless figure surrounded by circles, leave it where it lies. Do not touch it. Do not take it with you. It is a marker, a claim, the beginning of a hunt that has no conventional end. I'm leaving for Wisconsin as soon as I finish typing these words. I don't know what I'll find there, or if I'll ever return to any reality you would recognize. But I cannot continue in this half-existence, gradually fading from a world that was never mine to begin with. The stone now shows 8 circles. I believe when it reaches 9, 3 times 3, a completion of whatever ritual or process began in that forest, the final transition will occur. I will be fully claimed, fully collected. Before that happens, I intend to return to the cabin to confront whatever dwells there on its own territory. Perhaps there's no way back to my reality. Perhaps there's no escape from what has already begun. But I refuse to simply wait here, fading away, watching the circles multiply around that headless figure until nothing of Thomas Carlton remains in any world. If by some miracle I survive, if I find a way to reverse what has been done to me, I'll update this account. If not, let it stand as testimony and warning. The forest is not empty. We are not alone in this world, or in the spaces between worlds, and some things that hunt us operate by rules and methods we cannot begin to comprehend. Stay out of the deep woods. Stay away from strange lights. And if you ever hear your name whispered from the darkness by a voice that sounds almost but not quite familiar, run, run, and pray they haven't already marked you as their own. Editor's note: the above text was found on an abandoned laptop in a Bozeman, Montana apartment in December 2022. The tenant, whose name was listed as Thomas Carlton on the rental agreement, disappeared without notice, leaving behind most of his belongings. Inquiries revealed no employment history, no prior address, and no family contacts. The laptop contained no other personal information, photographs, or communications, only this single document. Local police filed a missing persons report, but acknowledged that with so little information about the individual's background or connections, the case was unlikely to progress. The strange narrative was initially dismissed as creative fiction, perhaps the beginning of a horror novel the tenant had been writing. 3 months after Carlton's disappearance, a hiker in the Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest in Wisconsin discovered the remains of a small cabin near Alpine Lake, a structure not recorded in any Forest Service documents and apparently unknown to local rangers, despite regular surveys of the area. Within the cabin, investigators found evidence of multiple occupations over many years, newspaper clippings referring to missing hikers dating back decades, and a collection of small, circular stones, each etched with the same unusual symbol, a headless humanoid figure surrounded by varying numbers of circles. No trace of Thomas Carlton was found at the site. His disappearance remains unsolved, one of 27 similar cases connected to that particular region of the forest over the past 60 years. The cabin itself, according to the official report, burned to the ground in an unexplained fire the night after its discovery, destroying most physical evidence before it could be properly documented. Forest Service rangers continue to advise hikers to stay on marked trails and avoid camping near Alpine Lake, citing uncertain terrain and wildlife concerns as the official reason. The stones recovered from the cabin were placed into evidence storage at the Chequamegon County Sheriff's Department. According to department records, they were stolen during a break-in 3 weeks later. No suspects were ever identified, and no fingerprints were found at the scene, only a series of unusual markings on the evidence room door that the official report describes as similar to frost damage in patterns resembling elongated handprints. To date, no further information regarding Thomas Carlton, the cabin, or the stones has come to light.